Just must say, I've never seen anything like this Amendment 4, where you have massive amounts of money coming from out of state, massive left-wing groups, all the major organs of the far left, including people like George Soros, all involved in this amendment thing. And yet they don't say anything about what's actually in their amendment. They spend their entire millions and millions of dollars telling verifiable lies about the policies and laws of the state of Florida. Why wouldn't they be talking about all the different things that are going to happen if this were to be upended into Florida's Constitution? And I think the reason why they don't do that is because I know people wouldn't like it if they found out about it. And I know many people are finding out about it and are behaving appropriately in response to it. But this is a very intentionally deceptive and vague amendment that's written to basically deceive as many voters as possible so that they can somehow get this thing across the finish line. You see the advertising is 100% going on the deceptive track to just try to tell lie after lie after lie. That doesn't work. People do not want to be lied to. They want to know the truth. They want to know the truth about, should this be something that is added to Florida's Constitution? And when you're dealing with constitutional amendments, your default should always be no. They should have to prove to you why this particular amendment in any circumstance is something that should be added to the Constitution. And remember, this isn't just like a policy. You know, we have policies in Florida. We have a fatherhood initiative. It helps promote fatherhood, helps fathers. I think it's a good thing, but if you don't like it, you can elect somebody else and they can try to change it. You can always alter normal policies and legislation. Once it's in the Constitution, that's forever. You really have pretty much zero chance of ever changing it. And so you better know, go into this thing eyes wide open. You got to know what exactly they're trying to do here to this state. And if they don't convince you that this is something that'll be good, you should vote no regardless, right at that point. Here we have a situation where this is something that is really a Pandora's box for bad policies. And it's written in look, the way this process works in Florida, these groups spend massive amounts of money to get on the ballot. They write the language, and they write the language in ways that are poll tested to try to seem as innocuous as possible. This amendment doesn't define any of the terms that are actually in the amendment. That's not true for most amendments that have been added to Florida's Constitution. And so you go into it and what do these terms mean? Well, they have a specific idea of what those terms mean, and it's very, very extreme. It would make Florida one of the most radical abortion jurisdictions, not just in the United States, but anywhere in the world, if this were to pass. What are some of the lowlights, I would say, not highlights of this? If Amendment 4 is adopted, it would eliminate Florida's parents' rights for parental consent for minors and abortion. Right now, Florida, just like anything, as a parent, they can't give your child, if you have a high school child, sophomore in high school, they can't give Tylenol without a parent's consent. This would overrule that for abortion and say that minors can have abortion without the consent of their parents, and they know that's bad. They know parents don't like that. So what they're doing in the amendment is substituting notification, but that is not consent. Notification be they send a postcard to the parent or do something, but the parent would be stripped of the substantive right to parent with respect to this one issue. And it would be the only thing that's taken out under Florida law for parents' consent. And I don't think most people think that that's something that is reasonable at all. So don't be deceived by this bait and switch when they're talking about notification. That does overrule Florida's protections and parental consent statute. You also hear frequently, and look, different people have different views when it comes on right to life or not right to life. And there's people that just believe, and you would hear this a lot, like, look, they don't like abortion, they want it to be rare, but they don't support legal protections for the unborn because they say it should be something resolved between the mother and the doctor. And you hear that a lot. even in this, what they talk about with Amendment 4. The really crazy thing about this amendment is it eliminates the need to have doctors involved at all. And you got to read the fine print, you got to read very carefully, but any time in Florida you have an abortion, it must be done under the supervision of a licensed physician. And we've never deviated from that, and I don't think any other state has really deviated, certainly not very many, if any. So this is a real radical change to say you don't have to be a licensed physician. What they say is you need to be simply a healthcare provider. Well, what is that? They don't tell you what that is, but I can tell you if this were to pass, you would have clinics open up without physicians involved. If people tried to regulate it, they would sue and say, hey, I'm a healthcare provider, that's what the Constitution says, I have a right to do this, and you know what? They'd probably win in court. So taking physicians out and putting in, substituting healthcare providers, there's a lot of different people that qualify as healthcare providers that are far from being a licensed physician. So this really demotes physicians from the role they have in Florida law in a way that'll be very, very dangerous for Floridians and from other states, because they would, I think their intent would be to recruit people to come from other states, from Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, to come to Florida for this purpose and see non-physicians be green lighting an abortion up until birth. This amendment would allow them to do that based on whatever judgment they have, which is obviously less than a medical doctor's judgment. Very, very dangerous. What about your tax dollars? Now, this amendment will lead to lawsuits by the people that are proposing it, where they're going to go into court and they're going to say that because of this language, taxpayers should be required to fund these abortions. And so it will open the door, and it will eventually lead to taxpayer funding abortions. Well, how do you get there? In Michigan, the same groups did the same type of an amendment, although I actually think Michigan was less extreme than the Florida one, but they cited similar language. As soon as it was passed, they then turn around and they're now currently suing, trying to get the courts to say that taxpayers are required to fund. How many people want their tax dollars to be funding these elective abortions, but particularly late-term abortions, which this amendment would mandate be permitted? I don't think very many want to do, but that is a foreseeable consequence of this amendment passing. They also really don't set any meaningful limits on when, and I think there's different people, again, that have different views that range the gamut with respect to right to life, but I think most people believe there needs to be some limit at some point, and we can have disagreements about that, discussions about when that limit is appropriate, but this says that there should be no protections at all for the unborn child until viability, but they don't define what viability means. And the way they would construe it would be as radical as possible. It would mean you could have 6 months into pregnancy for no reason whatsoever in terms of medical or health or anything involving the mother, that you could go in and have a purely elective abortion. Mind you, at that point, that puts the unborn child through excruciating pain because they're capable of feeling pain, and most of those abortions are basically dismemberment abortions where they actually have to pull the baby's pieces apart in order to abort it. And that would be constitutionally mandated that that be allowed to take place in the state of Florida. But here's the thing. Even though they're playing bait and switch on viability, and the way they would construe it is very extreme and I think beyond what most people think would ever be appropriate, it really is a fig leaf, because if you read how the amendment goes, it says that any healthcare provider can greenlight an abortion at any time for, quote, health reasons, but they don't define that. So in Florida, there's exceptions for the life and physical health of the mother, but it's defined. This could be whatever some healthcare practitioner says, mental health, different types of things with that. And so that would mean there's no meaningful limits at that point, all the way up until 9 months. And people will sometimes say, oh, well, you know, some people have asked me, does that ever happen? It does happen. Of course it's rarer that that happens, but most late-term abortions in this country are, in fact, elective. And that's from, even liberal sources have acknowledged that fact. So states like Colorado, states like California, that is something that is permitted. That would be the case here in Florida, because the way this is written, it's basically an exception that swallows the rule. Now, patients' health. The amendment attempts to create, well, I mentioned kind of how they're doing with the bait and switch on the health. What they will do, though, because of the way this thing is written, there's a whole host of policies that, again, most people on whatever side of the abortion debate believe are common sense. All of those will likely be invalidated. Licensing and sanitation requirements for abortion facilities, admitting privileges and proximity requirements for abortions to be performed near a hospital by an admitted physician, so immediate life-saving treatment can be performed if something goes wrong. It will likely invalidate medical screening requirements, waiting periods that ensure women have all the relevant information about their procedure. It will likely invalidate required in-person counseling prior to an abortion, as well as informed consent literature to be available prior to that at these facilities. Certainly would invalidate anything involving required ultrasounds, certainly regulations surrounding abortion procedures and methods, because, for example, there's certain things like partial birth abortion, dismemberment abortion, all that would be wiped off the books, and would potentially impact the right of a child who survives an abortion to have life-saving treatment. You know, there's this dispute about Waltz in Minnesota, and the media is very dishonest about this because they're obviously on one side of this. What they have in Minnesota, they had a law that said if a baby survives a botched abortion, that there needs to be life-saving treatment. And Waltz repealed that, so if you have a child that survives an abortion attempt and they're born alive, that you have no obligation to provide any life-saving treatment. I just think that's horrific, but yet that very well may be what happens as a result about this amendment. And as I mentioned, the whole campaign are things that are basically just verifiable lies in terms of what they're doing and what they're saying Florida law is. And so let's just be clear about that. Under Florida law, abortions are permitted until a heartbeat is detected in the baby. Abortions are still allowed, though, in the cases of rape, incest, human trafficking, or when the child has a fatal fetal abnormality that will prevent him and her from surviving until after they were born, and abortions can be performed to protect the life and the health of the mother. That's just Florida law. Now, maybe you don't like that fact. Maybe you wish Florida law was different so that you could argue and run your commercials. But I think when people find out that, hey, that's what Florida law is, why are they telling me these lies? I do think it's a very risky strategy, because if you get people to believe the lies, fine. But if once they find out you're lying to them, then they tend to take anything you're saying with a grain of salt. And there is nothing ever in Florida law that would prevent a physician from providing appropriate medical treatment in these really, really significant circumstances. In fact, if you don't do that, if you don't provide that type of medical care as a physician, you are committing medical malpractice. So when you see some of these physicians say, oh, Florida law doesn't allow me, that is a lie. But I think it's even more serious than that, because as a professional, you have a duty to understand what the laws and policies are that govern the profession. And if you're not capable of understanding that, and you're engaging in this passive-aggressive behavior to say, oh, I somehow couldn't provide a treatment, that is somebody that's not equipped to practice medicine effectively. And so if you do not provide, and not only is it not prohibited, it's required, and you can lose your medical license if you are not doing that. And another thing is, there is no legal liability liability, criminal or civil, for any mothers who undergo abortion. A lot of these mothers are in very vulnerable circumstances. They don't get a lot of support, certainly from the fathers, unfortunately, in this day and age. And so it's a very difficult circumstances, and there is not liability under Florida law for any of that. So if any physician is telling you anything different, or any activist is telling you anything different, they are not telling you the truth. And the question is, why would you need to do that? Why would you need to deceive just to try to shoehorn this amendment in? Why don't you talk about all the things that are in that I just outlined and explain to people why you think it's appropriate to take away parental consent? Tell them why you think it's appropriate to displace the role of physicians and to displace them with simply a health care provider. Tell them why you don't believe that there should be any meaningful limits on when an abortion can be performed, and tell them why you think it'll be okay when these same groups pushing this amendment go into court if it passes and try to force taxpayers to have to fund all of this. Make those arguments and let people make decisions, but don't lie to the public. And so I'm glad that we have physicians here who are very clear-eyed about this and what it would mean for the state of Florida. You're going to hear from them in 1 second. Actually, we'll start right now. So it's my pleasure. We're going to hear from 6 different speakers, including the Lieutenant Governor at the end. But let's just be clear. You have no definitions in this amendment. You have no doctors required to be involved under this amendment, and you have really, really extreme policies, such as the lack of meaningful limits. That is not something that belongs in any state's constitution, much less the state of Florida. So I thank these folks for coming up and being willing to speak the truth. Okay.
I'm the taller of the Dr. Christies. Besides echoing the sentiments you've already heard, I'd like to make 3 additional points. First, I would like to directly address the deceptive and dishonest characterization of Amendment 4 by its advocates. And since I also happen to be a lawyer and I'm also a member of the Florida Board of Medicine, please let me set the record straight. This is a flyer I received in the mail this week at my house. It is sent by a well-financed group backing this amendment. Its main claim is simply a bald-faced lie. It tells Floridians that our current law has, and I'm going to quote here, I'll read it right from the flyer, it has no actual exceptions for rape, incest, or the health of the mother. The problem with this statement, as you've already heard, well, it's a complete and total lie. Because this, the relevant Florida statutes, is absolutely clear. It specifically and expressly permits abortion beyond the 6 weeks limit in the case of rape, incest, and the health of the mother. And if you're still unsure, please go online. You can read this for yourself. It's there for everyone to see. Politics, sadly, can bring out the worst in people, but there is never an excuse for flagrant dishonesty. The second point that I would like to make is that while many of our world's major religions speak powerfully and elegantly and persuasively about the dignity of all human life, Amendment 4 is not a religious issue. The physicians standing here beside me right now, they oppose Amendment 4 based on the science and the law and social justice concerns and morality and ethics and the visible evidence. And because we have all taken an oath to do no harm to our patients. We don't oppose this amendment simply because of our various religions. And by the way, we don't all have the same religion here on stage. People of all religions or no religion at all should stand proudly against Amendment 4. The last point I'd like to make does not come from my position as a physician or as a lawyer or as the member of the Florida Board of Medicine, but as a man who spent the first 35 years of his life as a secular pro-choice liberal. And having lived in both the pro-choice and the pro-life worlds, I know the emotions and I know the arguments that both sides absolutely feel right now. And many of my dearest friends and even family members don't agree on some of these issues. So I'm always looking for opportunities where pro-life and pro-choice people can find some common ground, some common consensus. And opposition to Amendment 4 is precisely this opportunity. This is not an us versus them. This isn't a religious versus non-religious. This isn't conservative versus liberals or Harris versus Trump issue at all. It's simply an issue of safety and common sense. We can all stand together and oppose an amendment that would permit unregulated abortion at any time during pregnancy, that would remove physicians from the decision-making process, and would even eliminate parental consent for our young girls. That's a radical and dangerous amendment, and one that has no place in a compassionate and moral society. Amendment 4 is simply bad for women. It's bad for Florida, and that's something we can all agree on. So please join me and vote no on 4 this November 5th. Thank you for your time.